I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about the offer from our sponsor, The Great Courses. This month is a free month of access to the Great Courses Plus app. So it looks like this. You have your phone or whatever device you're using. You touch on the app like that, boom, and the courses pop up. There's a whole variety of them, really hundreds that you can access. So let's say you're interested in taking this one, The Black Death, which is one I'm currently listening to. And the 24 different lectures pop up. Now, if you're already in the course, the lecture will just pick up wherever it is you last left off, which is a nice feature. Or if you just want to skip around, like say you want to skip from lecture 2 to lecture 13, Medieval Theories about the Black Death, you just touch on that, boom, and a little summary of the lecture pops up, so you can read about whether you want to listen to it or not. And then when you're ready to listen to it, you just hit play, and you're off and running. Now, if you don't want to do that and you decide you want to change courses in the middle, you can just do that. Here's a course I already took, Understanding the Dark Side of Human Nature. This is 24 lectures by Daniel Breyer. Anyway, you get the idea. So the offer this month is a free month of access to the Great Courses Plus. And to do that, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. As usual, every week we feature an author with a new book. This week it is Judith Finlayson. She's a science writer. The book is You Are What Your Grandparents Ate, What You Need to Know About Nutrition, Experience, Epigenetics, and the Origins of Chronic Disease. She's not a medical doctor or a medical researcher. She's a science writer. But that's fine. I thought I was going to be more skeptical of the book than I was. Turns out she's reasonably cautious as she goes along, reporting on the research in this area. There's a lot of junk science, a lot of pseudoscience in this epigenetic area, not on the part of the researchers as much as the media that covers it, and particularly the sort of alternative medicine people that take one small little finding and then run with it. As I mentioned in our conversation, the secret kind of claims, that if you just think certain positive thoughts, it'll change your epigenetics and then your life will be great and so on. Obviously not that simple. And I do push back on a number of points, which, she seemed to agree with me on. So I was encouraged by that. Mainly, these are really, really hard problems to solve. That is, the origins and causes of chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, various cancers, and so on. It's just really hard to know what exactly all the different variables are and what percentage they account for the effects in any given person or population and so on. Anyway, so we get into all that. It's an interesting conversation in a sense. It's also important in terms of, and I push her on this, what should I eat? What lifestyle changes should I make? What do we know? And as you'll see, it's hard to know. It's really hard to tell. But in any case, that's the point of science, continually pushing forward to see what we can figure out. And so enjoy this conversation. And if you appreciate the podcast, as usual, we appreciate your support, which you can do at skeptic.com/donate or at Patreon, or just call the office and you can get our number and address and so on at skeptic.com. So thanks for listening. And with that, I give you Judith Finlayson. Judith, thanks for coming on the show. Your new book is You Are What Your Grandparents Ate. What you need to know about nutrition, experience, epigenetics, and the origins of chronic disease. So, well, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's a beautifully produced book. I have to say, as an author myself, I always appreciate when publishers put a little extra time into the design and layout and quality paper. It's always nice when there's a quality paper. It's not going to turn yellow in 6 months. So you must be pretty proud of how the book turned out.
They really part.
Yeah, why don't you give us a little bit of background, how you came, you're an author and you've written quite a few books and you've written for the Globe and Mail as a journalist reporting on a lot of these stories. How did you come to write this particular book?
Well, this particular book is the coming together of a couple of sets of interests. Food had always been my passion and my hobby, and while I was a journalist doing other things. And I had an opportunity to write a cookbook about little over 15 years ago, and that cookbook did very well. So I decided I might write cookbooks for a while. And I did that. And while I was writing cookbooks, became particularly interested in nutrition and food as medicine and began to explore those avenues. And that led me into, by kind of various different routes, discovering David Barker. And David Barker was an epidemiologist who's British. And he was finding, he did a book or a study called the Atlas of Mortality based on British statistics. And he was finding really links between poverty and heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
Poorest areas of Britain were the areas of Britain that had the highest rates of heart disease. So he became very interested in why this was happening, because this was kind of late 70s, early 80s. And as you will recall, that was when heart disease was very much thought to be a disease of affluence. It was linked with eating too much meat and with high cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
That clearly wasn't what was going on in these pockets of England that were having very high rates of heart disease. He was a very intuitive person. I'm sorry I never got to meet him, but he sounds a little eccentric, really, really, really intelligent, and very intuitive. And he began to think that there was something that was going on related to what was happening to people while they were in utero or in the early parts of their lives. But he needed birth records. He needed things that broke out of, as you know, epidemiology is the study of large groups of populations and disease incidence in those. But he needed to be able to drill down into that. And through a long route, he discovered a cache of records that are now known as the Hertfordshire Ledgers. And they were kept at the turn of the 20th century, around 1911, when the British government became very interested because the health of the British citizens were very poor. And I love the story of, I tell it in the book, E. Margaret Burnside, who was the chief inspector of midwives for Hertfordshire. And she was a very formidable woman by all accounts. And so she put together this program of midwives and health visitors who went into homes. And because E. Margaret was E. Margaret, they took very, very detailed accounts of birth weight. They visited conditions in the home and what the baby weighed at age 1. And through these records, David Barker was able to show that low birth weight was very connected to heart disease later in life. And this was very significant because unlike geographical correlations, which, you know, possibly it was something in the water, maybe something in the air, these showed that actually there was a strong link between what happened in utero and what happened 50, 60 years later.
So that's, and the low birth rate was the proxy for whatever that something is.
That was. And low birth weight is still very much a marker for chronic disease. It's a bit crude, and there are other things that happen. But if you're one of the people who study this kind of thing, if you do see low birth weight, you know, it sends up a kind of signal, and you would begin to look more deeply.
Wasn't high birth rate is also, sorry. High on the birth rate. No, sorry, not birth weight. There's a bell curve there. You want to be between the two standard deviations one on each side, or something like that. Either too little or too much is a proxy for later disease, right?
That is absolutely correct. The first studies were showing low birth weight, but yes, when they got more data and began to look at them, it comes up as what they call a U curve. So it's high and low.
Yeah.
But what you want really for health is to be somewhere in the middle, not too low and not too high. He published these findings in the Lancet in 1986 as something known as the Barker hypothesis. And the Barker hypothesis people thought it was just crazy. I mean, they just thought it was, how could this happen? But he carried on, and he then found another group of records related to what happened during the Dutch hunger winter. And the Dutch hunger winter was a period in the Second World War when the Germans cut off food supplies to Holland. And so it provided really, in terms of a horrible situation, but a really interesting, almost laboratory circumstances for studying the effects of famine on later health. And so he managed to get a hold of those records and worked with one of the people who was still involved. They're still using this birth cohort to find all kinds of things. That confirmed a lot of what he had. It confirmed the Hertfordshire stuff and moved it a little further along. So they found heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. The babies who were in utero during that period were about twice as likely to have any of those conditions. As I said, a lot of people were trying to disprove David Barker. And one of them was an epidemiologist in Finland who thought he was crazy, named Johan Eriksson. And Johan Eriksson actually had, because the Finns keep incredible, as do the Dutch, very detailed health records. But the Finns in particular had started something called the Helsinki birth cohort in the 1930s, and they tracked not only through the first year, but up until the kids were 11. So this cache of records was really able to distinguish patterns of growth. Did people who had disease grow differently? Johan Eriksson thought that he could use this to prove that David Barker was wrong. In fact, that never happened. He actually started working with David Barker, and the two of them have used the Helsinki birth cohort to produce together over 120 studies that really confirmed what he had found in Hertfordshire and extended all the information further along.
And again, this is in utero environment and its effects decades later, or even half a century later.
70 years.
70 years later.
David, it starts manifesting before that, but David Barker could see, even when he was just using epidemiological data, that there was a link between high maternal mortality, high neonatal mortality, both of which would be very likely linked with malnutrition, poor living conditions, poverty, and the incidence of stroke 70 years later. And he was seeing that as an epidemiologist.
Right.
Around 2000, the year 2000, the tide started to turn when a couple of major U.S. epidemiologists, one from Harvard and one who was running the nurses study, which is a very famous epidemiological study, admitted that they had finally become convinced by Dr. Barker's research. And also around that same time, he was invited to speak to the National Institutes of Health, which I'm told, if you're a scientist, is kind of the gold standard, and it means that you've passed go.
Mm-hmm.
What this developmental origins of health and disease is the field of research that has resulted or grown out of Dr. Barker's original research. That represents, in broad terms, the marriage of two sciences. And it's the marriage of epidemiology and the marriage of epigenetics. Now, epigenetics, and I'm going to read you my definition so that I get it exactly right. So you have epidemiology, which is the study of disease patterns in populations of people with a view towards identifying the underlying causes of illness. But epigenetics is over and above genes, and it's the study of changes in organisms caused by modifications of gene expression rather than the genetic code itself. And epigenetic modifications are a process influencing gene expression that acts like a kind of biological memory that stamps experience on cells. So what we find in epigenetics and what has shown, Dr. Barker's original work was focusing on organ development and how the fetus will compensate by, for instance, in situations of poor nutrition, it will sacrifice, say, the kidneys. It has a hierarchy of organ development. And since the placenta does the work of the kidneys while the embryo is in the womb, it doesn't need them. So if there's a shortage of nutrients, it will sacrifice, say, nephrons. And so you'll grow up with a kidney that has fewer nephrons and is less efficient. But epigenetics comes along and begins to show that a lot of things like experiences to the mother, what she eats while she's pregnant, if she has exposure to toxins, influences gene expression as the fetus is developing. So cell differentiation happens. How does the embryo become this? How do you develop liver cells, brain cells, heart cells from, just the sperm and the egg? And that's really a process of cell differentiation that occurs through epigenetics. The science of epigenetics was evolving or developing, I'd say throughout the 20th century. But in terms of development, human development, it really began to take off around the 1990s. But it was interesting because there was a Swedish epidemiologist, Lars Bergen, and he grew up in a town called Överkalix. And for some reason, I don't know why, he began to suspect that there was a link between years when there were great harvests, years when there were poor harvests, and the health of citizens later on. So he used historical data, and he found that there was a link between feast famine and the long-term health of males in the town, and that is that his data could show that males whose grandfathers had overeaten around the time of puberty, which is around the time their sperm cells are forming, that's the key developmental thing, their grandson died 6 years sooner than those whose grandfathers experienced a normal situation. No one would publish his studies, even though they agreed that his statistics were sound. And Dr. Bergen decided that he really needed someone who had some technical genetic skill that could explain that he was having. So he was looking around. Meanwhile, a British geneticist named Marcus Pembry was studying Prader-Willi syndrome and Angelman syndrome. And they're both result as a defect on a particular chromosome. But what he found is that it's the exact same chromosome, but if you inherit the variation from your mother, you get one disease. If you inherit it from your father, you get the other. And as a geneticist, he found this really bizarre because there was some biological memory, which is what Lars Bergen was seeing in the grandsons whose grandfathers had experienced overeating. So how is this happening? So the two of them teamed up, and they did a number of studies to explore the idea of what's known as epigenetic inheritance. And that is really the marriage of epigenetics and epidemiology. And that is a great step forward in terms of the developmental origins of health and disease. And we know what we know about, we know that some of this works because around the late 90s, we had a study on agouti mice. And those researchers agouti mice were pet mice who were bred to be particularly beautiful. They had orange coats, beautiful things. But the problem was the more beautiful the mouse, the worse its health. And it was the agouti gene. Breeders were breeding for, it turned out, a defect in the agouti gene. What researchers at Duke University were able to show in the 1990s was that by adjusting nutrition, but with a combination of B12, folate, choline, a couple of other nutrients, that they could actually change the health status of agouti mice and produce mice who would give birth to healthy mice by supplementing with these nutrients.
So the nutrients presumably turned the gene back on or turned it off or whatever the sequence was. Let's just back up for a second by way of example. Let's say my father was born in 28, my mom in 1931. So let's say they had crappy diets during the Depression, and then I'm born in 54. So let's say some genes that I inherited from my parents were turned, let's just say for experiment purposes, were turned off because of these crappy diets. And now the question is, let's say I eat a healthy diet when I'm 1 or whatever, 6 months old or something like this. And not that kids in their 1950s ate particularly good diets, but let's just say that they did. Would that gene then turn back on, and then my kids would have the turned on gene?
It's more of it's turned up or turned down, rather than turned off or turned on. Turned on and turned off is an imprinting thing, and that's a little different from gene expression, which is really about volume of genes. But I can tell you a little bit about how your mother and father would pass on those genes, and they would pass them on. It's not pass on your genes, but pass on the gene expression. So the females are born with their life supply of eggs. So that life supply, your eggs are really a function of your genes. But while those eggs are developing, they are developing when, say, your mother was in your grandmother's womb.
Mm-hmm.
So the air that your grandmother breathed, the food that she ate, the water that she drank has an influence on how those eggs are expressed, how the genes in those eggs are expressed. And that is what influences your health in terms of whether you are more prone for, say, a chronic disease. We're also male sperm cells, they develop in puberty. So that's why Marcus Pembry and Lars Bergen could show that boys who started to smoke around the time that their sperm cells were forming were more likely to produce sons who were obese. So the expression of those genes is changed as in response to to environmental factors like nutrition, like toxins. Transgenerational inheritance, that's, people say it's still a very early thing.
Yeah.
We see it epidemiologically. We see it a lot we can see it in lab studies. People say that the naysayers say it doesn't happen because there's a period of development when all of the programming, the epigenetic programming, the methylation is wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
Methylation is just one of the epigenetic processes. We know most about methylation, and the epigenetic processes are the ones that turn your certain genes up or down. We know most about methylation. We know some about histones and some about RNA, and it turns out they think there are more, but that's still very much out there. But when they study methylation, they can find different methylation in sperm at different sperm cells at different ages. They can find they can find it in umbilical cords, and so they can test it back to things like toxins that the mother may have consumed while she was pregnant. With epigenetic inheritance or transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, which is that your cells, the reproductive cells, that is the sperm and the egg, carry, and the easiest way to describe it is probably biological memories of experiences. So to come back to your grandmother, what your grandmother ate, the air that she breathed, the water that she drank, would influence or has influenced your mother's eggs, one of which is the egg that formed you.
Mm-hmm.
And those impacts trigger changes, not in the genes themselves, but in how those genes are expressed. And these genes are known as epigenetic modifications, and they are passed on to future generations through sperm and egg cells. We know that some methylation marks get passed through, even though the old thinking was that they all got wiped out at this period in zygote development. And we know that histones do, and probably RNA. So there are more than methylation changes being passed on. So basically, we know that your health is a legacy because you've inherited it from your parents, and your grandparents.
Well,
and you
in part a legacy. Obviously, what
Yeah.
I eat now very much matters for my health in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years.
That's correct.
And whether I
And
work out or not, and the air that I breathe and the environment that I live in, for me, not just for my offspring and their offspring, but for me too. So we're talking about multi variables, and let's drill down a little bit on the difficulty of proving causality, particularly in medicine. What we're talking about here are correlational studies. That is, one variable is associated with another variable. That's one thing to say. It's another thing to say, X caused Y. Very difficult to prove in medical settings. Determining that HIV was associated with the set of symptoms called AIDS was known before the causal vector was determined. And therefore, the so-called HIV/AIDS skeptics were not completely crazy initially. There's a certain normal amount of skepticism that's reasonable for anybody who comes in to challenge the dogma. I don't even like the word dogma. It's just whatever the currently accepted paradigm is. There's usually a good reason why it's currently accepted. And to overturn it, you need to be able to account for all the things that the current paradigm accounts for and the anomalies that the current paradigm doesn't account for. And sometimes you can do it, sometimes you don't. The initial idea on ulcers, for example, with all these environmental factors, stress and so forth. And it turns out, no, actually, it's this virus. Oh, okay. And that took a while, though, to determine the causality of that. Even smoking and cancer, that took a while to determine the causality. The association was there for a long time, clearly enough to give warnings to people. But, the tobacco industry exploited that problem I'm describing, which is that you don't have to have the causal vector before you can say, well, the fact that this is associated with that, you should at least probably change your behavior or your diet or your lifestyle or whatever. So in other words, I'm distinguishing between these kind of correlational studies that epidemiologists talk about and then taking the next step and saying this causes that. And I think that second step is harder to make with these, not just epidemiological studies, but especially when you marry it to this epigenetics, which is still fairly new. And there's a lot of junk science, pseudoscience out there associated with it. You see people that are into The Secret and all that stuff saying, if you think happy thoughts, it's going to change your genes and all this stuff. That it's just, I think that's going way overboard. So that the harder part, I think, is going to be figuring out exactly with like the methylation that seems more solid than some of the histones and some of the others. And there surely must be many more to go. So a harder problem here is, say, back to your legacy, your health is a legacy. Yes, it's a legacy, but I can change the legacy. So obviously it's only one factor in my health and my child's health and their future children's health and so on. Obviously the current air I breathe is going to affect, or the food that I eat and so on. And even that is a difficult scientific problem. I mean, I've had on the podcast, I had Nina Teicholz, the journalist that wrote that book, A Big Fat Surprise, challenging the dogma that, eating too much meat and too much fat is unhealthy. She and my friend Gary Taubes, who've been, they're like your hero, Barker. They've been pushing against this, what they call the dogma. I'm not sure it's a dogma, but they claim it's a dogma. That eating meat leads to heart disease, eating animal fat leads to heart disease, and so on. You should eat, non-fat milk, and so on. They say that's a bunch of baloney. You should eat whole fat milk, whole fat yogurt, steaks, bacon and eggs, slam them down every day, no problem. Well, wait a minute. Where did the dogma come from in the first place that you shouldn't eat that stuff? And this to me is way harder than most of us recognize when we're just trying to decide, what should I have for breakfast this morning? It's hard to know for sure. And, and so, they claim that the reason for the obesity problem and diabetes problem and so on is that people gave up all that, dense calories and proteins, and instead they're slamming down cheap calories and sugar. It's the sugar and the cheap calories that are the problem. Now, you've been writing cookbooks, so I don't know. I'd love to know what you think about that as well.
I'm a great fan of Gary Tobbs. I mean,
You are?
I've quoted him in his book. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm also a great fan of lots of fruits and vegetables. That works too.
Yeah.
So, you're quite right. There is no dogma. But if you take it back to this research, what they've said, the experts now say about 25% is a guess, and this is a good guess, but an informed guess, of chronic illness can be linked to what happened in utero. But what you have going on is a combination. I don't think there is going to be one single answer for anybody.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're ever going to really know, well, yes, you did that, and so therefore such and such happened.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that that genes are there. Your genes are there, and the genes themselves may predispose you. Like the BRCA gene, I think 60%, but 40% don't.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does the other 40% shake out? Or why is the 60% more likely? And that you can start to link to. So it's a combination of genes, and it's a combination of the environment and changes in gene expression. And so, yes, you may have been dealt a bad hand, in terms of, your mother didn't have a great diet. There was a lot of stress. Stress is another big one. The experts are saying that stress and poverty are as impactful as nutrition.
Stress because of inflammation, at least inflammation?
Just epigenetic changes. But yes, inflammation is one of them. And inflammation can also come from a whole lot of different things. I mean, processed foods are, a trigger. We know that mummies, for instance, had high rates of atherosclerosis. So where did that come from? So that's not processed foods. That's not the obesogenic environment. But what a common link when they looked at that was smoke. And so, so we're now seeing that inflammation, recent studies are showing links with inflammation and air pollution and smog. So it's all of these things coming together. But you can change your gene expression, and you can change it very quickly. Weight loss, for instance, if you're overweight, losing as little as 6 pounds can really positively impact your epigenome. Exercise, as little as 8 weeks, and they've seen positive changes in things like methylation and so on. So it's really how everything fits together. And when I started to do the book, I really hadn't intended to do anything on the microbiome. But I'm really glad I did. The whole last chapter is the microbiome, because that's a whole new area. And really, your gut bacteria they certainly influence metabolism. They certainly influence the immune system. And I mean, here's another interesting connection. Gut bacteria influence the immune system. Kids who have more diverse bacteria are less likely to have allergies. People who have heart disease.
Play in the dirt.
Exactly, yeah. Or let the dog climb all over
right.
your kids. People who have heart disease are more likely to have allergies, or people with allergies are more likely to have heart disease. Inflammation they all come together. So the whole thing is that we aren't just disconnected organs. all these systems are interconnected and work together. And so if you affect one, you affect the other, and the other affects the other, and your gut bacteria are in there probably running the show the more that we learn.
Mm-hmm.
So
let's take the BRCA gene case, where if you have the bad combination, I forget what it is now, 2 genes or something like this, you should get a double mastectomy, and the whole thing is pretty dramatic. I haven't followed where this has gone in the last couple of years, but is there any new research on this idea of turning genes, not on or off, but up or down, or getting them to express more, that you could do something before you have to take this dramatic step of getting surgery and so forth?
I would feel very uncomfortable talking about that, because the BRCA situation is really one where there's a high impact of genes. But most genes are multifactorial, or most diseases are multifactorial. So something like heart disease or diabetes is a much more, or even obesity, where they have shown certain genes that are linked with those conditions. But it's a combination, each of them, of a whole lot of genes, like a bunch, and each of them having a very small impact. So when you're into those multifactorial diseases, yes, then you can do a lot to change it by changing diet and so on. I mean, most of the studies that we show are where they've begun to see this. They've studied identical twins. Identical twins have the same genome, but they don't get the same diseases. So why don't they get the same diseases? And a lot of that's environment, and a lot of it is the impact of epigenetics. So
how would their epigenetics be different? Identical twins, just slightly different environment in utero?
Yes, sometimes they do have different epigenomes when they come out of the utero, which is really surprising when they come out of the womb. But they find that, I mean, one kid goes to daycare, the other kid goes to circus camp. And they find that their epigenomes differ much more dramatically as they age and begin to have different life experiences.
Have you ever seen that documentary? What is it? Forks Over Knives, I think it's called. This is Dr. Esseltine's vegan plant-based diet program. The idea of forks is instead of knives, to have surgery to fix your heart disease by having bypass surgery, you eat plants. Anyway, but he showed, at least in this documentary and in the accompanying books, they claim they can completely reverse heart disease, diabetes, and so on with a plant-based diet. Completely, 100%. I mean, just it clears the arteries up. Clinton went on this diet. I think Esseltine was actually his doctor. Totally plant-based diet, lost all that weight, and his supposedly his cardiovascular disease disappeared. Type 2 diabetes cleared up just with diet. Not him, but other patients. I don't know how much you follow all that research. I mean, my friend John Mackey's the CEO of Whole Foods. He's pretty hardcore vegan, and again, counter to say Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz, their arguments are just as good on the other side. Like, no, you should just eat plants because animal product foods are not healthy. And then you read the research by Nina in her book. It's like, no, animal products are actually good. I really don't know what to think. I mean, it's crazy that, here we are in almost the third decade of the 21st century. And when I go into Starbucks, I'm still not sure if I should get the oatmeal or the egg sandwich.
Well, I think it just, you probably be able to tell. Do you feel better after eating the egg sandwich or there is the one thing I would say from having finished this book is that no one diet works for every single person. And, they found things like, I forget is it genistein? No, green tea. So if you have a particular gene, it will help you with breast cancer. And if you don't have that gene, it will be of no help at all. So it really is a very individualized approach to diet. I think we do know in general terms that, I mean, it's what Michael Pollan said, eat mostly plants.
Yeah.
Eat food, mostly plants, not too much.
Right.
And don't eat anything that your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food.
Right.
And
Right.
that's probably a pretty good rule of thumb. Although some people do very, very well on high meat diets, and the keto diet works for people. The one thing we do know with diabetes is that losing weight is the key.
Mm-hmm.
So, however you can lose weight will really have the best impact on reversing diabetes.
Yeah.
And
even if we don't know the exact causal vector, just the association enough, if it's strong enough, is good to give it advice on lifestyle changes, diet changes.
Yes, absolutely. Weight's a huge one. Obesity is a huge one. It's the mother lode for diabetes, for heart disease, links with the non-alcoholic fatty liver, with hypertension. It's much more than being overweight, and that's something. If you do start to put on weight, that in theory you can try to nip in the bud.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to lose weight, and it's more difficult for some people than for others. I mean, some people go on a low carb diet and can be svelte in no time. Other people, look at a carb and they gain 20 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
But that's nutrigenomics or epigenetics. They're both new things that are looking at this. And I think they have a lot of promise, but it's very out there right now in terms of science.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. All the stuff in your book, all the papers you cite, I think it's still kind of preliminary, but interesting or not interesting enough. The connection is there strong enough to pursue further research. And so, for example, just to bring it back to a personal example, I've always had slightly high cholesterol. My father had it. He died of a heart attack at 61. His father died of a heart attack at around the same age. His brother died of a heart attack around the same age. So I'm now 3 years older than my dad, almost 4 years older than when he died. So, and I'm an exercise nut, just because, well, I enjoy it, but also because of this other thing, like I better do this. And but my cholesterol, without taking a statin, it's high. It doesn't matter. When I was a professional bike racer in the 1980s riding, I was training 500 miles a week. I mean, we're talking 40 to 50 hours of exercise a week. And my cholesterol just didn't budge. So, it was my doctors just said, well, it's genetic. Now I'm thinking after reading your book, maybe it's not just genetic. That's too simple. It's epigenetic or something like that. But then reading your book, I'm thinking, well, if I can get genes to turn up or down, why can't I change my cholesterol by changing my diet and exercising? It just doesn't seem to budge much for me. Other people I know change their diets and they do budge their cholesterol. So maybe some of this epigenetic stuff is you can change it. Maybe some of it you can't, or maybe it's not epigenetics. Maybe it's just genetics.
I'm not a doctor. I can't give you medical advice, but my gut instinct is probably there's an actual hardwired genetic thing, because some people are very hard. I mean, we know that there are people who have certain genes and who have high cholesterol as a result of that genetic condition. They usually develop it very young. I mean, it's a serious condition and it's treated. But, there may well be people who, like you, who may have a stronger, because they have Dr. Jenkins and that plant-based diet has done a lot of with lowering cholesterol only through changing diet on many people. They have shown, and I wonder, I don't know about cholesterol, but with obesity, they have shown that your gut bacteria influence whether you can lose weight or not. So obese people have different microbiomes from people who are not obese or overweight. And they have what's called dysbiotic, too many bad bacteria in relation to good bacteria. So if they can introduce more positive bacteria, they can assist with weight loss.
How do you
And
know?
they see,
How do you know what your
yeah,
How do you know what your gut biome is? Is there a test you can get or something?
you can do stool tests. There, you're in California, so Rob Knight, I think, runs. I
Oh,
forget what
okay.
it's the Human Microbiome Project or something.
Right.
So you
My
can,
friend Deepak Chopra, he's into all this stuff. He did a huge study at his Chopra Center last year that was published, I don't know, no, about 2 years ago, published last year, comparing professional meditators to amateur meditators to no meditation as it affects their epigenetics. And there was an effect. That is to say, at his center, you go, and the average person like me doesn't do it at all. And then they train you and say, here's how to do meditation, and you do it. Versus the other group is people brought in that they meditate a couple hours a day, and they've been doing this for decades, so they really know how to do it. So he and Rudy Tanzi from Harvard found a statistically significant difference between those two groups. That the meditators were, for whatever reason, it altered their epigenetic profile, particularly related to inflammation, stress hormones, and that sort of thing. Pretty much what you'd expect. You expect meditation to make you calmer, and those stress hormones that pump through your body that cause inflammation, they're not there in the same level as us non-meditators. Anyway, I thought that was interesting on that aspect.
yes, I've actually taken mindfulness course.
Hmm.
I have to admit I'm not terribly good at it. I
Mm-hmm.
have a really hard time keeping my mind focused on
Apparently
breathing.
that's normal, because that's how I feel too.
It's well, I think if you're somebody who thinks a lot, it's hard to really not think. But yeah, it's been shown to really change the epigenome and to change genes and to cope with stress. And stress is very important. I mean, we know, for instance, that heart disease has a strong link with poverty and with adverse childhood experience. And Marcus Pembry, who teamed up with the Swedish epidemiologist Lars Bergen early on to do the cigarette smoking and studies. He did a test on comparing men who had grown up in affluent childhoods and those who had less fortunate experiences. And he discovered that they had entire networks of genes that were different. And these were linked with heart disease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk in the book, toward the end of the book, about socioeconomic class and the sort of new problem we have where poor people used to starve. Now they're obese, and mainly because their diets are just really crappy diets, mostly sugar and processed foods and so forth. So the link between poverty is what, not being able to afford, or having the educated parents to know what are good healthy foods to eat. I mean, it's sort of the complaint about Whole Foods is that it's so expensive to eat high quality foods. I'm not sure that's actually true. I'm told you can buy these foods at the same price as processed foods. Fresh fruits and vegetables aren't that expensive if you know where to get them. It's more of an effort you have to make. And maybe poorer people don't have the education to know how to do that, or don't know where to go, or they don't have the time because they work 2 jobs or whatever to put into that.
Yeah, with poverty and nutrition specifically, or with epigenetics. I mean, you can actually see the links with poverty because it's all encompassing. So you have limited access to nutritious foods. And that's not just financial. It is financial to some extent, but processed foods are much more readily available.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in an area where, say, it's very unsafe, you don't want to go out at night, so they live in areas that they describe as food deserts.
Mm-hmm.
So they have access to these cheap, nutrition deficient but high calorie foods, but they can't access fresh foods. They're more prone to adverse experiences, which are stressful. There was that adverse childhood experiences study done a few years ago that showed that the more adverse experiences you had as a child, the greater your risk of developing a chronic disease. I think it was like with 7, you were 3 times more likely to get serious heart disease or cancer or something like that. So poverty is a really, it's what they would call an intersectional problem, where a whole lot of things come together. And poor people the rates of obesity in poor people are much higher than they are in people who are more affluent. They tend to smoke more. It's just an all-encompassing problem in terms of chronic disease development and epigenetic issues.
Yeah, let's say somebody is raised in an environment like that, but they pull themselves out. They end up at Harvard. They get a great job. They read your book and they think, I got to change my epigenome. How do I do it?
Well, exercise. Start eating nutritious foods would be the first one. Good foods and good exercise. Meditation would certainly help. Probably, I mean, I don't want to say everybody needs psychotherapy, but we do know that the effects of a hardscrabble upbringing are very, very long-lasting on the epigenome. They have people who grew up in poverty. It affects their methylation, and that tends to stay unless you begin to change it. There was a group of physicians, Johns Hopkins study, and they found that the rates of heart disease in those physicians who had grown up, even though they were very affluent, but if they'd grown up in poverty, were still much higher. So it's a very tough thing to change. But if we start, I mean, really what we should be starting is, because we know where it starts, we know a lot of it starts in the womb. So, why don't we have more programs to make sure that women who are pregnant are well fed and have access to nutritious foods, particularly kids, but particularly during the first 2 years when those growth rates, how you grow, also institutes serious changes and can predispose you to things like hypertension and so on. So, making sure that those kids are fed. School lunch programs. I mean, it seems that everything that's happening on kind of a policy level is really creating situations that worsen these situations. We have the statistics from the organization 1,000 Days that say $1 spent in prevention saves $48 in healthcare costs
decades later. Yeah. So if you had some say on the budget for allocating, say, school lunches, food stamps for poor people, single moms, and all that, how would you change things?
Well, gosh, I'd certainly pour money into programs that ensured that pregnant women had access to foods and were educated about it. Because you're right. I mean, some of this is that some people need to be educated about the benefits of nutritious food and school lunch programs. It would be things like farmers markets, community markets, community gardens in impoverished areas. And that's great because that gets kids out digging in the dirt. When I was a kid, my grandmother had a garden. I used to love going and picking, and then I got my mother gave me my own little patch, and I dug and grew a few radishes. But I now know that was great because I was getting all those great dirt bacteria. So it's kind of just as all of these negatives create an overwhelming problem synergistically, positive things do too. They grow. So, not only do you get great food from a community garden, you get great bacteria, you get exercise, you get sunshine, um, you know, forest walking. The Japanese have that whole forest walking thing. Well, that's been shown to be very good for your gut bacteria. So you're improving on a whole lot of different things. With uh, people who are having problems with poverty and with nutritious food, I would also want to try and ensure that they had access to good prebiotic foods that supported development of a healthy microbiome.
What would that be? What would examples of that be?
Nuts, seeds, fruits and vegetables, the fiber, polyphenols, yogurt, the prebiotics and the probiotics. So that's a whole other thing because nurturing, you are what the subtitle should be in my book. You are what your gut bacteria eat.
Yeah. One of the TEDs I attended, I forget the guy's name. He was a famous chef who undertook going to poor communities to show them how to eat. And his claim, at least at TED, was that it wasn't, the money is not the problem. You can buy fruits and vegetables relatively cheap. You don't have to go to Whole Foods. Pretty much every market has fruits and vegetables. But you have to know that's what I want. But also his other point was that it takes a little more time to prep a meal with fresh vegetables. You got to steam them and so on versus, a junk food burger from McDonald's or whatever. It's faster, easier. Maybe part of this, maybe it's not just education too. I also mentioned time and stress. If you're a single mom working 2 jobs, who has time to go shop every day to get the fresh food and then bring it home and steam it and prepare the vegetables and all that stuff? That takes not just knowledge, but time.
Oh, absolutely. So that you're really getting into issues of food insecurity. And food insecurity is a huge problem. It affects about 40% of people in North America, and it's mostly people who are on the lower socioeconomic scale, but it also affects people who aren't. And that's for reasons of time. So you think if you're a soccer mom, you're getting the kids to soccer practice or whatever, you will often resort to processed foods rather than preparing a meal. So things like food prep, doing it ahead of time, but or big batch cooking and freezing it, then whatever. All those are techniques, and I think that a lot of people are beginning to think about how to address some of these problems, and we're seeing, I think, some creative solutions. For instance, there are books on food prep. My daughter does this. My daughter has a baby, and she does food prep on Sundays and has all the stuff ready, and so she can eat healthy during the week. She's very well organized in that regard. So
your daughter's going to want to know what you ate when you were in the first 1,000 days of your life and how that affects her daughter.
She probably does. She's probably a bit tired of me. I have a grandson, and
grandson,
right. I'm big on him watching his gut bacteria. I know they're doing, like, he's being breastfed, so I know that's good. But so I'm,
But there and then it matters what she eats.
Yes, it does. But she was very I actually gave her the manuscript in manuscript form for the book, all the stuff on pregnancy and so on, to make sure she was following the nutritional guidelines. Because but she's always eaten well, but she's, we do. I like to cook. I find it very relaxing. So at the end of the day, if I'm working all day, I quite enjoy coming down and puttering around in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm home, so I don't, I work from home, so I don't have to travel. And so we can eat nutritious meals, but that's it's a luxury and a privilege. Many people can't, have difficulty with that.
So this link between epidemiology and epigenetics, your book brings us up to date to about, I guess, the end of 2018 or so of research papers. What's the future of this science, and where are you seeing the directions moving toward to refine some of these recommendations based on the research?
It's growing so quickly, and that was one of the problems I had working on the book, because I cite a study, I'd go back to check something in the study, and I'd find there were 5 more studies that I then had to look at. Mm-hmm. So we are seeing. I think what we're going to see some focus on say nutritional epigenetics, where they can begin to zero out some specific substances in food or some specific nutrients. I mean, we've been engaged. This stuff isn't really new because folate. We've been adding folate to food supply for 20 years or so.
That's right. Yeah, good point.
Really, that is really epigenetics. We know that produces changes that reduce the incidence of spinal cord defects. So it's been around for a while, although we haven't known it. I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see more tailoring of diets.
What do you mean?
More evidence that say this diet doesn't work for you.
Well, personalized medicine. Yeah.
Yes, personalized medicine. Just as they're doing it now with pharmacology, and I think we'll see more of it in terms of food.
Yeah, I think the problem has been, when we say, does it work? We want to know, does it work for everybody? And clearly what you're showing with this epigenetic research is it depends. Maybe you can eat meat and I can't because of, a whole series of these complex genetic and epigenetic effects. So that then would require not just your personal genome, but your personal epigenome, or however that would be. So, 23andMe, maybe this is where they're going to go next.
Yes. I have to say, I had my genes done a number of years ago, and it was really the most helpful thing I've ever done. Because I could see I have methylation issues. And I have certain genes that I don't detox well. So I was having, I have to be very, very careful about, whenever I'm prescribed a drug or whatever, that because I just don't detox it. It collects and it builds up in my body. And I'm a slow metabolizer on coffee. So I have 1 cup a day.
Did you do the 23andMe or one of the other ones?
I did a different one through another group. But I found it very, very helpful. And I'd love to do more. Now, when you get into your epigenome, that's much more complex than genes. Yeah. Because kind of anything can happen. Right. Anything can impact and anything can happen. It's really what they describe as a field of possibilities. So,
yeah, when I did the 23andMe, just for one of my columns in Scientific American, it was really frustrating to try to say anything of substance. Like I did test for the 2 genes for Alzheimer's, and I didn't have them. So I thought, okay, I'm in the clear, but I'm reading the fine print. It's like, okay, I'm not actually in the clear. But if I did have the 2 genes, would I be pretty likely to get it? No, not necessarily. It's like, okay, what can I actually write in a sentence as the take-home message from that particular part of the 23andMe finding, and it was really hard.
Yeah, it's not a direct line, and it's not a direct line because of epigenetics.
Yeah.
So you can take, in many cases, a bad hand in genes,
Yeah.
and modify it. But if you if you know you have a bad hand, as I did with some of my methylation related genes, I was able to introduce some nutrient therapy that helped. So that was, for me, it was a very positive thing to do.
Nutrient therapy. I don't think I've heard that expression.
Well, things like I take methylated folate.
Okay. Oh, so supplements.
Yeah, supplements.
Yeah.
Because it to support my faulty methylation,
right.
or weak methylation, or whatever you want to call it.
If what are the symptoms of that weak methylation?
I should have high homocysteine, which would put me at a greater risk for stroke.
Okay.
But if I take these methylated vitamins, I don't. I test my homocysteine now.
Oh, okay.
I watch it very carefully because I know that it's a risk factor.
Right.
And so I don't have it.
Right. Well, I'm just going to keep riding my bike and eating pretty moderately and just try to lead a stress-free life and hope for the best. That's
not a bad idea. That's really a lot of what you can do.
Yeah. Yeah. Either way, whether it affects epigenetics or not, either way, those are good things to do. that kind of general lifestyle change. Well, Judith, we've been going over an hour. I want to be mindful of your time. I note that you've written cookbooks. Is that the next book based, basically the cookbook for epigenetics?
That's too complicated.
I think that I think it'd be pretty speculative.
A single answer to a very complex, very, very extensive problem. But I would say, really, it's just a nutrient-dense diet.
Mm-hmm.
Exercise. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Your epigenome.
Right.
It's a nutrient-dense diet. Exercise, an active lifestyle. Don't have a sedentary lifestyle. Clean air. Avoid toxic exposure. But so it's great if you can do that. But, one of the subtexts of the book is that a lot of people can, and poverty is one of the structural impediments to really being able to do many of the things that some of us are able to do to support our epidemic.
Well, that was another thing I wanted to ask you before I let you go. You talked a lot about poverty, but then you mentioned income disparity. Now, what do I care how much Bill Gates makes as long as I'm above the poverty line significantly enough, my diet's good, and I live in an area with clean air and so on. It's not that, is it the disparity? Everybody talks about income inequality today as a problem, but why is it a problem? What do I care how much the 1% make as long as I'm not getting robbed or I still have a decent life?
Well, the statistics show that the more equitable a society is, the healthier it is. And I think those were coming out of Japan in about the 90s. They have linked income disparity with earlier death. Basically, you should care because you should be concerned about other people, not necessarily yourself, only yourself.
But it kind of assumes like a fixed pie, like a zero-sum game. The more that the upper 1% make, the less the lowest 10% make, or something like that. But it's not a fixed pie. The goal is to get everybody above the poverty line, and then everybody up to a point where everyone eats 3 square meals a day and so on, and has, a living wage, and regardless of what the top people do.
Yes, that's true. I was going to say something and I forgot what it was. It was
On income?
about income, and I can't remember if it was.
Oh, minimum wage, maybe? Because you wrote about that a little bit too.
It did.
The problem with the issue with minimum wage for you would be making enough money to at least be able to afford quality food and a decent place to live on one, say, full-time job.
Well, that's right. And what we've seen is that you can't do that anymore.
Right.
I mean, I grew up in the era where you could.
Yeah. Right.
But nowadays, both my parents would have been working to
Yeah.
support them.
Yeah.
And that puts a lot of stress on families.
Right.
So that's a problem. But no, I think it was linked to. I now can't remember. I've been talking for too long. I've lost my chain of thought.
You need some more folate or some more or methylated.
My folate this morning.
Something like that.
So that's not it. I can't. I've lost that thought.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's probably one of the circuits that went early on, 10 years ago.
Well, there's supposedly things you could take that enhance memory or whatever. I'm pretty skeptical of most of those supplement type diets. Beyond the basics of what you need, vitamin D and vitamin C and so forth. Most of which you can get from high quality food, by which I mean fruits and vegetables and so on. The additional supplements, other than like the examples you gave of what you take, things to improve your IQ or your memory or whatever. That seems to be a bit of a reach.
Yeah. It does. But there are some. I mean, this is the links with Alzheimer's are a bit still out there. They haven't really looked at it. But I mean, as you know, there are certain genes. But then the issue is your epigenome and how that interrelates. One of the interesting things I turned up, and again, it's speculative, but with Alzheimer's, some people are calling it type 3 diabetes. Because it's linked with how your brain processes glucose. And I think that's a really interesting avenue that they are looking at and will be looking at more, because we do know that the epigenetic changes in the womb that take place at the fetus are linked with metabolic changes. So things like, so you see it shakes out in terms of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension. Those things are very closely linked to adverse experiences in utero and to the epigenetic changes.
Oh, and let's not forget sleep. That's another new one.
Sleep, yes.
Good 8 hours a day. I bet that probably has effects on epigenetic effects.
It does, and it has. Sleep is very, very important, and just get lots of sleep is all I can say.
Last time I talked to Rudy Tanzi about this, he's the head of the Alzheimer's project at Harvard Medical, and he was looking into inflammation. That is what produces the plaques and tangles in neurons in Alzheimer's disease. That we don't know for sure all the factors, but he thinks inflammation may be one of them.
Yeah, I would. Inflammation runs very closely or very tightly through a lot of these things, and it seems to be an interconnector. Not only heart disease, but as I said, it's also linked with your gut bacteria. And it can be linked with certain birth situations. Low birth weight babies tend to be born in an inflammatory state. So it's there, and it's just waiting to rear its ugly head, I think, when it's given half of an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, Judith, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us about this. I think another 10 years or 20 years, there's going to be so much more to think about with the epigenetics. The best argument for being chronically frozen is coming back in like 200 years and finding out what we didn't know today. It turns out I should have drank more beer or not, or I don't know what.
It will be interesting to see, because it's certainly a whole new avenue of exploration. I don't know if epigenetics will have all the answers. I mean, that's what's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When they discovered genes and DNA and the double helix and all that, they really thought that once they mapped the genome, they would know everything.
Yeah, turns out not.
Then epigenetics was just coming along at about the same time that they finished mapping the genome, and epigenetics was saying, "Hey, hold on, it isn't genes."
I found this article as I was researching this in the Journal of Epidemiology, The 7 Plagues of Epigenetic Epidemiology, Bastian Ejmans and Jonathan Mill. This is 2012. The last one. There is a considerable interest in epigenetic research in the popular press. The current study is a vivid illustration. Even though the authors deem it preliminary, it was widely covered by the media. Epigenetics should avoid some of the hype that surrounded the early days of genetic epidemiology. After the draft human genome sequence was announced in 2001, it was widely perceived that we would soon understand the causes of most common diseases and how to treat them. This expectation was not realistic, but not always renounced by geneticists. Currently, many scientists outside the field are disappointed by the results of human genetics, and in particular GWASs. I forget what that is now. Despite their overall considerable success, genetic epidemiology has proven to be harder than expected, despite the favorable starting point of thousands of Mendelian diseases and the high heritabilities associated with most traits to be examined. Very much like genetics, epigenetics will not be able to deliver the miracles it is sometimes claimed it will. Anyway, just thought I'd offer that cautionary point there from those. That's 2012. Of course, that's 7 years old now. But anyway.
Well, I don't disagree with it. I think there's always some new kid on the block who's going to come along. But, but we are moving the science forward. We did get answers. We did get leads. We did learn a lot from genes. And we're in the same stage with epigenetics. And right now, it's the new kid on the block, and everybody thinks it's going to have all the answers. Well, it has quite a few answers, as it turns out. But are those all the answers? I don't think so.
Right.
But I'm in no position to tell you what's going to overturn this particular apple cart.
Right.
But it's fascinating to see, because we can see strong statistical connections with things like nutrition in the womb, how pregnant women are fed, with toxic exposures. DES story is one of the most colorful and horrible of changes in doctrine disrupting chemicals in the womb, and how that affected the baby girls who were born, who developed a rare cancer as a result of it. And we're now
as a result of what? I missed it.
Of DES, which was a drug that was prescribed to pregnant women, if I remember correctly, for nausea. But I'm not. Yes, I think it was for nausea, to prevent nausea.
Wow.
And the female fetuses of the mothers were showing, when they were young girls, start to show a very rare type of gynecological cancer. And it was eventually traced back to this drug that their mothers had taken. The children, the daughters of the DES daughters, as they're now called, are now showing reproductive problems.
Wow.
And it seems that the mothers who took it, who would be quite old now, are developing breast cancer also, and their daughters at an unusual rate. So it's just a horrible thing. But that's a toxic exposure. So we do know a lot about how some of these things are affecting us, and we can. I mean, the folate is a story of how we can take steps to improve nutrition. I mean, those poor little agouti mice. They don't have to die. They don't have to be beautiful and die young anymore. They can be plain brown mice and live happy lives and produce happy, healthy offspring.
Judith, thank you. Congratulations on the book. Hope it does well. Keep the conversation going.
Thank you.